So we have the Torah portion of Matos Masey this week, a double portion. Obviously too much to cover in one class, but nevertheless, it starts out about vows and the laws of the vows for men, for women, married women, almost married women, and so on. And then it talks about the war that the Jewish people had with the Midianites and the captives that they captured and the utensils that they got and how they kasher them and what they did with the booty and how they divided it. And then we come to the sons of Gad and Reuven, who wanted to remain on the other side of the Jordan River and stay in the territory that was conquered by Moshe against Sichon and Og. And Moshe agrees as long as they agree to go fight against the Jewish people in the land of Canaan.
In front of everybody else.
In front of everybody else, correct. They're like the Marines. And then at the very end of that parsha, we have some of the members of the tribe of Manasseh going to conquer some of the cities of that territory. So even though that war happened a few parshias ago, when Moshe and the entire Jewish people battled Sichon and Og and their armies, but there were a few pockets that had not been conquered yet, and they were conquered by individuals from the tribe of Manasseh, as we're going to read now. But just to go through Parshas Masey quickly, just to give you an idea, Parshas Masey talks about the travels of the Jewish people in the desert. It's basically the end of the 40 years, because the next Parsha is already the first of Devarim, which is a recap. When Moshe Rabbeinu recaps everything, both in terms of history and in terms of mitzvahs, and gives the Jewish people a pep talk. So in terms of the 4 books, this is like the end of it. So it goes through the 42 journeys, and then it talks about the borders of the land of Israel, setting up the cities of the Leviim, setting up the cities of refuge for a person who kills by accident. And finally, the end of it is about the daughters of Tzlofchad. Once again, we read about them last week, but in this week's parsha, we read about them.
Hello.
Yep, we're here.
Okay, I received your beneficiary form.
This is our sitting.
But I'm looking for in trust trust form. Is this the same thing?
I think you're talking to somebody else.
So what, instead of putting it?
Okay, there goes that. Feel free to unmute yourself as needed. Okay. So the point is that let's go back to the last 2 verses of Parshas Matos. The Yor ben Menashe halach. Yor ben Menashe went. Vayilkoid es chavoisehem, and he captured their villages. Vayikra eshen chavois Yoir, and he called those villages the cities of Yoir. The previous verse talks about Moshe giving the area called Gilad to Mocher ben Menashe, Mocher the son of Menashe. Presumably that was Yoir's brother. And then we read that Yoir conquered the villages. And he gave them a name, Chavois Yoir. Chavois presumably means villages, villages of Yoir. And then the last verse of the parsha, of the first of these 2 parshias, says, V'noivach halach, and Noivach went. It seems like Noivach was the son of Yoir. Vayilker es Kenos ve'es b'naiseha, and he captured Kenos and its daughters, which is an expression for villages, also suburbs, like the daughter is dependent on the mother. So the villages are kind of, secondary to the main city. Vayikra lo Noivach b'shmoi, and he called it Noivach by name. Okay, seems simple enough. Not much to talk about here. Yet there always is something to talk about. Yes, Mordechai, you have a question?
Yeah, the one, the last pasuk with Novak, it has a cruel truck marking on it that only appears a few times in the Torah. Vayikra Allah
Yes,
Novak Bishmo.
yes, that is true. A mercha kfula. So what's the significance? I'm ready to hear.
I don't know what the significance is.
Okay. I know shalsheles, they talk about it meaning a trepidation and a moment of, hesitancy. They talk about that in terms of Yosef and Aaron and Loit and Eliezer. There's only four of them in the Torah. But I don't know what they say about the Mercha Kfula and its significance. But I'm sure there's something. So Rashi says,
Rabbi,
yes, please.
I'm not sure, but I think that Chavot Yair is in Syria, or the border between Syria and Lebanon.
Well, it's definitely not in what we call Israel today because it's on the other side of the Jordan River. I don't know if it's in what is today Syria or today Jordan. I don't think it's in Lebanon. It could be in Syria or in Jordan, but it's not in what they call Israel today because it's on Ever HaYarden. It's the other side of the Jordan River.
Because I know there was a talk about the claim that Israel had against Syria that they wanted the Chavot Yair.
I think they should get it by all means. They should get all of biblical Israel up till the Pras River, the Euphrates River. But without a fight, the Arabs should say, yes, it's yours. That's what it says in the Torah. We're moving to Uganda, and that's it. Hashem should help.
Okay.
So Rashi says, Chavoisehem, Rashi says, Kifar Nehoin. In the English, Chavoisehem, this is rendered in the Targum by their villages. And the next Rashi says, Vayikra eshem Chavois Yoyer. He called them Chavois Yoyer. Rashi says, Lefi shelo yehoyu lo bonim, because he had no sons, Karasam b'shmoi lezikaron. He called them by his own name as a memory. Everybody wants to be remembered after they pass to the next world. They don't want to just be like forgotten, like they never existed. So we hopefully have children, our children remember us, grandchildren, and so on and so forth. Also, our deeds become our memory. Like we have in Parshas Noach, where it says, Eila Toldos Noach, these are the Toldos, literally the children of. Rashi says, according to one interpretation, it's referring to the good deeds of Noach. Because the good deeds of a righteous person is like their children. It's what comes out of them. And that's what remains behind in this world, the effect of the good deeds. But some people like having a physical remembrance. So he wanted to have something physical that people would remember him with. And that's why he called these villages that he captured Chavois Yoyer, so people should remember him. Now, as an aside, who was this Yoyer ben Menashe? This is not the main topic of our talk and our discussion today. But as a side point, this Yoyer ben Menashe was a great person. I mean, we see he was special just from the fact that he was still alive when they got to the land of Israel. We're talking about, 210 years after, or counting the 40 years in the desert, 250 years after the Jews came to Egypt. and he was the son of Menashe. So Menashe was born already by the time they came to Egypt. Maybe he wasn't born yet, but he definitely was born sometime after that. So we're talking about him being alive for hundreds of years. Obviously, he was a special man to survive that long. He must have been a great tzaddik. Now, by the way, in case you're wondering, how does a person survive when it was decreed that all the men above the age of 20 should die in the desert? How is he still alive? I'll take any answers on that one if you have any. I'll repeat the question one more time in case you missed it. Yor ben Menashe was seemingly the son of Menashe, and therefore he would have been extremely old, certainly above the age of 20, by the time of the spies when it was decreed that that entire generation should die in the desert. And he was not a Levi, obviously.
He was probably supported the spies that came with the positive opinion.
Yeah, but it didn't work that way. There was no Jew left alive. Zero. I shouldn't say zero. There were 2 Jews left alive from the 12 tribes.
Caleb ben Yefuneh and
Exactly.
Joshua.
And Yehoshua, exactly. That's it. There was no exceptions. You couldn't say, yeah, but I didn't really mean it, and it wasn't me.
But what about Korach's sons? They were kept alive.
They were Leviim.
Oh, they're living. Yeah. Then I don't know.
So maybe because
well-
he didn't have sons. He didn't have sons, he called the city on his name, right? Because he didn't have sons.
Why would that explain why he didn't die?
So that's the only way his family would get a place in Israel is if he was coming into Israel or coming to the other side of the Jordan River.
That's going to be it. There's going to be nobody to continue after he's dead anyway. So eventually he's going to die. He's not going to live forever.
Yeah, but he might have, nieces, nephews, whatever.
Yeah, but they could get it directly. Why does it have to come through him? Yes, Mordechai.
Yeah, well, isn't there something that the death process was every year on Tisha B'Av? The ones who were turning 60 were the ones to die. And so, according to that, the ones that were above 60 were exempt from this death decree.
So what you're saying is true, although it's not, those two things are not necessarily connected, but what you're saying is true. The first thing you said is true, that they would die at the age of 60 on Tisha B'Av. And the second thing is also true, because the Gemara says that the decree only applied to people between the ages of 20 and 60. Those were the ages of the people that were counted for war, for the purposes of war, and the decree only applied to them. So it's not clear exactly why the people over 60 were exempted. Is it that they did not participate in the complaints? We don't know exactly why, but they were not included. And the Gemara actually proves this from none other than Yor ben Menashe and his brother Machir ben Menashe in these very verses, that they were much above 20 and they were still alive. And the Gemara proves from this that those that were over 60 were not included in the decree. That's correct. Okay, now, despite the fact that he was quite a warrior, as we see that he conquered these cities, unfortunately, he did not survive all of his battles. He passed away in the battle of Ai. The Jewish people, when they entered the land of Israel, the first battle they had was against Yericho. In that battle, there was a man who took from the spoils, when Yehoshua had declared that all of the spoils were to be dedicated to the Beis Hamikdash, nobody was allowed to take for themselves. And there was a man by the name of Achan who did take for himself, as a result of which the Jews lost the next battle. Now the verse says that 36 men passed away of the Jewish people in that battle. However, according to our sages, there was only one man who passed away, and his name was Yair ben Menashe. But he's called 36 because he was such a tzaddik that he was equal to a majority of the members of the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin is 71. He was like a majority of the members of the Sanhedrin. That's how great he was. And unfortunately, he passed away in that battle. And he's the only Jew, by the way, that passed away in all of the battles that the Jews had with the Canaanites. He was the only casualty. It was a pretty miraculous war, but he died as a result of that sin. Okay, that was just a little side point. So now we go back to this discussion here. The Rebbe asks a few questions on these Rashis. 2 questions in particular. And then, of course, one of the questions answers the other. So first of all, Rashi translates Chavosehem as Kfar Nehoin, their villages. The word Kfar means a village, like Kfar Chabad in Israel, the village of Chabad. Now, there are other interpretations of Chavosehem. For example, Ibn Ezra, another commentary on the Torah, says that Chavosehem means Kirayot. Kirayot is an expression for a strong city, a well-populated city. So how does Rashi know that it's referring specifically to the villages and not to the Kirayot? What is he basing, or why is he accepting the translation of the Onkelos versus that translation? Another translation is by the Radak, Rab David Kimchi, another medieval commentator on the Torah. He says that it means a wide open city, as opposed to a walled city. It means a wide open city. In those days, most of the large cities were walled, because the population wanted to be able to protect itself against, other tribes and armies and whatnot. So that the standard thing was to make a wall. But there were some cities that were open, and these were open cities according to the Radak. But once again, Rashi does not accept either of those interpretations. Rather, he says villages specifically. Another question. How does Rashi know that Yair had no children? Where does Rashi get that from? I mean, maybe there's a medrash that says that. But Rashi usually tries to follow the simple interpretation of the verse. Where do we see in the Tanakh that Yair had no children? The fact that he named a city after himself is not a reason to say that he had no children. Because many people named cities after themselves, even though they had children. Take, for example, in the Torah portion of Bereshis, the very first city that we see is named after a person, is the city of Chanoich. It says that Cain built a city. Cain was the son of Adam and Chava. He's the one who killed his brother Hevel. He had a son by the name of Chanoich, not to be confused, by the way, by a person of the same name, Chanoich, who had no sin and he died early, or maybe he went up to heaven alive. This is a different Chanoich. This Chanoich, his father built a city and named it after him. Now, Chanoich had children, and the Torah lists his children and his descendants and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, his father wanted to honor him, and the city that he built, he named after his son. And of course, we have plenty of cities around the world named after people with children. Georgetown must be named after King George or something. Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. Did he have children? I don't even know if he did, actually. Caesarea, named after Caesar. The Herodium, King Herod named it after himself. I believe he did have children. So not having children is a reason to call a city after oneself, but it's not the only reason. People might want to be remembered by the city besides the children that they have. So why does Rashi insist that he had no children?
Rabbi, in
Yeah.
Hebrew, it doesn't say he had no children. It says he didn't have sons. ויקרא אותן חוות יאיר לפי שלא היו לו בנים, קראתם בשמו לזיכרון.
I'm going to venture to say that here we translate banim as children. That's my guess. Sometimes banim means sons, and sometimes it means children. I'm going to venture to guess that here it means children.
Oh,
Because
okay.
daughters, then his daughters are going to remember him, and his grandchildren, and so on and so forth. I'm not sure. I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure, but it would seem to me that in the context here it means children. Okay, so here is an explanation.
In Pinchas, it doesn't appear. His name doesn't appear
In where?
in Parshat Pinchas, where they give the names of the families in the description of the family of Menashe. It doesn't appear there.
I mean, it only lists certain people. It only lists like the heads of families. Maybe his family was too small to deserve being listed as a separate family.
But it lists Machir. It lists. I'm looking at it. It's
Yeah, but even if you say he had no children, you're not answering that question because he was alive. Why isn't he listed? He was alive. The answer is he's alive, but he's a single guy, so it's not worth listing. He's only one person. In the same way, you could say he had a small family, and therefore his family did not deserve to be mentioned, even though it existed. I'm just looking back at those verses. Bnei Yosef l'mishpatam nasher Avraham, Yehulidet Gilad, Gilad mishpat Giladi. Bnei Gilad.
Maybe he was part of another family.
Okay, you're forcing me to talk about another topic that I wasn't going to, but I have no choice. There is an opinion, actually, that Yair ben Menashe was not the son of Menashe at all. There is an opinion that Yair ben Menashe was actually the son of Seguv, whose mother was the daughter of Machir ben Menashe, and whose father was Chetzron from the family of Yehuda. And you'll ask where I'm getting all these names from. Well, these are verses in Divrei Hayamim. When it talks about the family of Yehuda, and it talks about the fellow named Chetzron, and it talks about him taking a second wife when he was 60 years old, and that wife was the daughter of Machir ben Menashe, and he had Seguv, and Seguv had a child by the name of Yair. And then it says that Yair conquered cities and he called them Chavot Yair. So like, what's going on here? Who is this Yair? Is he Ben Menashe or is he Ben Seguv? And if he's the son of Seguv, then how does he pop up here in the portion of the land that's going to Menashe? It's very unusual. So some say these are two different people. There was Yair, who was literally Ben Menashe, and he survived all that time in the Egypt and the desert, like we said before. And he conquered the cities, and they were called Chavot Yair. Unfortunately, they were retaken by Gentiles, and somebody else by the name of Yair ben Seguv, who was related, by the way, to the tribe of Menashe through his maternal grandmother, but he was not the same Yair. He went back and he conquered those same cities, and he called them Chavot Yair once again. That's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is that this is one and the same person, and he was not 200 years old. He's only called Ben Menashe because he was a descendant of Menashe. And really, he was not Menashe's son at all. He was Menashe's great-grandson. And not even paternal great-grandson, because he was from Menashe's daughter. And therefore, according to this opinion, we must say that he either got these cities through his maternal grandmother, because you can inherit from a mother as well, or he got them from his wife, that he married a woman from Menashe and a husband.
Rabbi, we lost you.
On my phone while I'm giving this class, sorry about that. According to that opinion, he got this section by the merit of his wife. So that would answer, by the way, if it's the same person, if Yair ben Menashe is really Yair ben Seguv, that would explain why he's not listed in Parshas Pinchas, because he actually was not a member of the tribe of Menashe at all. He was a member of a totally different tribe. Okay, now I said it. If you're on my email list, you'll get more information, Bezrat Hashem, when it comes out. Okay, so back to our discussion here about Yair ben Menashe and these cities and how Rashi knows that he had no children. So the Rebbe explains that the Torah does not have to give us all the information. There's so much information that the Torah leaves out because it's not important for us to know. Take, for example, Parshas Chukas, which we had a few weeks ago. Parshas Chukas starts with the burning of the red heifer, which according to the Talmud happened on the second day of Nisan, here in the desert. And then it skips ahead 39 years to the death of Miriam. In between, the truth is that the burning of the Paraduma was out of order. So really the last thing that we know about that happened in the desert was the story with Korach. In between Korach and the death of Miriam was almost 39 years with zero information. We don't know anything about those years. Now, I'm sure stuff happened. Things happen because people have disputes and people make up and they traveled and they probably had interactions with the nations around them, just like they did later on. But the Torah did not deem that information important, so it left it out. And the same thing goes for a lot of information that we have in the Medrash We don't even have anything in the Medrash, by the way, about those 38 years. There's just no information about them. But there is a lot of information. Take, for example, in the book of Bereshis, there's a whole Medrash called Sefer HaYashar, and that's a Medrash that goes, it's like, it goes along with the story of Bereshis. You can read it together with every story, and it fills in a lot of details. But the Torah did not include those details because it didn't feel it was important for us to read on a daily, weekly, and yearly basis and so on, even though they might be important. That's what the Medrash does add them, but it's not important enough to make it into the big leagues, so to speak, into the written Torah. So we don't have to know every name that every person gave to cities that they conquered. It's not really important. If the Torah tells it to us, it must be that it's teaching us something. Let's take, for example, the city that I just mentioned. That Cain built a city and he named it after his son Chanoch. Why is that important? The answer is because if you remember, Cain killed Hevel, and there was a decree made that he should be a wandering person. He'll never be able to stick around in one place for too long. And that's exactly why he could not name a city after himself, because he couldn't settle down in any one city. And that's why instead he called it after his son, Hanoch. Another example, in this very parsha, just a few verses earlier, it talks about the members of the tribes of Reuven and Gad coming to cities and building them. And it talks about the fact that they changed their name. It says the city of Nevoi and Baal Me'oin and Sivma, their names were changed. And they gave their own names to towns that they rebuilt. Why is that important? Because it's teaching you that you're not allowed to mention idols. You're not supposed to mention the names of other gods. Shem Elohim Acherim Lo Yisazkiru Lo Yishama Al Picha. The names of other gods you shouldn't mention. They shouldn't be heard in your mouth. You should try to blot them out rather than mention them. You're not supposed to use a church, for example, as a landmark and say, meet me at the church or turn right at the church. You're not supposed to mention them because you're supposed to blot out their memory. So that's why it tells us those names, and it mentions that they changed the name. The fact that it talks about Yair and the cities that he built, and it gives us the name, clues us in to tell us that there's something more to the story here. It's not just a name. There's a significance here. So Rashi's looking for significance. He's looking for clues. And he examines the words of the verse very carefully. Let's look back at the first verse. Yair ben Menashe halach vayilkod et chavotehem. Yair ben Menashe went and he conquered chavotehem, which means their villages, plural. It's villages and it's their villages. That means that it's the villages of many other places. It's the chavot of many other places. Now we're talking about the land of Gilad, which is in the previous verse. If it's referring to large populated cities or unwalled cities, let it say chavoteha in the singular, its villages, sorry, not villages, its populated cities, or its unwalled cities. What's chavotehem? Their villages. So that clues Rashi in to teach us that it's the villages of many other places. It's the chavot of many other places. Meaning to say, It's the villages of many cities. There were many cities in Gilad, and he conquered the villages of those cities. And that's why it's Chavotehem, their plural villages. And this also answers another question, by the way. Because in Parshat Devarim, which we're going to read next week, where there's a review and Moshe Rabbeinu goes over what happened in the desert, he mentions at the end of that Torah portion about Yair conquering Chevel Argov. And it talks about Chevel Argov having 60 cities, fortified cities. So what's going on here? Did he conquer villages or did he conquer cities? Which one? And if it's both, then why does it only mention the villages here? So here we're coming to the punchline. Yair conquered cities and he conquered villages, but he wanted to name something in the place of his children that he didn't have, and he wanted to name something that would be mindful and remind people about children. The villages are compared to the daughters of the cities, like we see in the very next verse, that Novach went and he conquered Kenat and Benoteha, its dependencies, meaning to say its villages. So villages are often called the Banot, the daughters of the main cities. And therefore, even though he conquered cities, he didn't call the cities Chavot Yair or anything Yair, because he wanted something that's associated with children to have his name. That's why he called them, specifically the villages, Chavot Yair. I'm not done yet, but if there's any questions, now's a good time. Okay, so why did he not call them Benot Yair? And why does the verse not say Benotehem instead of Chavotehem? So here we have an idea that sometimes the letter Vav can be exchanged for the letter Yud and vice versa. An example of this is the name Chava, Adam and Chava. Why did Adam call his wife Chava? Rashi says, Ki hi haita em kol chai. That's not Rashi, sorry, that's the pasuk. The verse says, she was the mother of all living human beings. Now the word chai is with a yud, not with a vav. Nevertheless, chava is meaning the same meaning as chaya, as living, because the vav and the yud can be interchanged grammatically. So therefore, first of all, that explains why the villages are called chavotehem or chava in the singular. Because villages generally actually provide life-giving sustenance to the cities. Usually the villages are the ones that actually have the farmers that are working the land and are schlepping in that produce into the cities to sell. And the same thing with the livestock and the animals and the chickens and maybe even the water as well. They schlep in, who knows what they bring there. So they're really like the stream of life for the cities. That's a reason that they're called Chavotehem. And it's also a reason why Yair wanted to call those villages with the name Chavot Yair, because it means the life of Yair. Following again what we were saying, that the Vav and the Yud can be interchanged, so it's like Chaya or Chayot, the life of. He wanted his name to be remembered as something alive, the memory of him to remain alive. So it's like he named the cities the life of Yair. And notice his name also means something positive, shining light, and so on. the life of the shining light, pretty intense names for those villages. So the Rebbe connects this with what we were saying before, that the members of the tribes of Reuven and Gad conquered cities and transformed the names, changed the names from names that are associated with idol worship to names, to Jewish names, Hebrew names. And the commentaries say, Rabbeinu Bachaye says, that that's actually one of the reasons they wanted to settle the land. Because it bothered them that those cities had these negative names. They said, we're going to come in here and we're going to change that. They wanted to take away the negative energy of the place and bring in the positive energy. So following along in a similar theme, one can say the same thing about what Yair was trying to accomplish. As follows. Sometimes we speak about a villager as opposed to a member of a big city in a way that a villager is like simple, maybe he's more like a peasant, not so sophisticated, not so learned. Like we see, for example, when we talk about the two prophets, Yechezkel and Yeshayahu, we speak about Yechezkel as being like a ben kfar, like a villager, compared to Yeshayahu, who was a ben krach, like a city person. Because Yeshayahu was on a much higher level, and he was used to seeing angels. He wasn't so, excited when he saw them. Yechezkel was super excited. It was something new for him. So the villager has like a connotation of somebody who's more a little bit on the outside, not so into it. And this was another thing that Yair was trying to accomplish by conquering these cities and changing their names and giving them a name of Chavot Yair, the life of Yair, the shining life, because he was trying to accomplish this very idea of taking a place as a village, taking a place that's not known to be sophisticated, to be well-versed in Torah, to be aware of godliness, and to transform it into a place of light and living light, so to speak, Chavot Yair. And this is the accomplishment that Yair tried and succeeded in accomplishing. It's interesting, by the way, I mentioned about Yair ben Seguv, perhaps conquering those same cities. Believe it or not, there's a third Yair who's even later, and he was one of the Shoftim, and it talks about him having 30 sons, and those sons also conquering cities and calling them Chavot Yair. It's not clear if they were the same cities or not, but if they were, it just goes to show how these names, this name, Chavot Yair, kept on coming back and coming back. And it shows on his positive accomplishment that his transformation of those villages was something that was lasting. Even when it was taken away from the Jewish people, it came back again and again. And that's because of his work to perpetuate his name, specifically by transforming a place of simplicity into a place of light. Questions?
Was that the same guy, the same shofet that had the 30 sons ride on 30 Yarim?
There were two shoftim.
Or 70 Yarim, I don't remember.
Yes, yeah, there were two shoftim who had that kind of description.
Okay.
One was Yair, I think Yair was one of them, and another one was Ivtzan. I don't remember which one was which.
Okay, one of them had, I know each one of his sons had a Yair, which is a horse, a young horse.
Right.
And they were riding them.
Yeah, I don't remember for sure.
Yeah, okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I took a medication that is putting me to sleep during the class off and on. So
Okay.
maybe for a takeaway, maybe you want to call somebody in advance so that they can prepare some thoughts.
Okay, who's going to do that?
Not all at once.
I'm just looking at chapter 12 of Shoftim because you asked about the sons and the daughters. So Ivtzan had 30 sons and 30 daughters. Elon has Vuloni. It doesn't say. Avdon ben Hillel had 40 sons and 30 daughters. And they rode on 70 ayarim.
There you go.
Yep, 70 ayarim. But I'm not seeing Yair here. I have to track him down. I don't know exactly where he is. Okay, we do have a few spare minutes, and I thought that we might have some extra time, which is why you'll find something on the handout that I sent out. You'll find some pictures on the second page. You see them?
Not yet. Let's see.
I see them.
Okay.
Oh,
So
the pictures?
the pictures, exactly.
2 pictures I see.
2 pictures, exactly. They're both of the same.
Moshe,
They're both the same person. That's Reb
The
Moshe. And the
Moshe
picture
in
is
the middle, they say.
exactly in the middle. He's walking his daughter to the chuppah.
Yeah.
And in the other picture, he's also the one sitting there in the middle, and he's watching the dancing at his daughter's wedding. So this story is it's about children. And since we spoke about Yair ben Menashe not having children, I thought I would share this story, even though it's not related to not having children per se, but nevertheless, it's a very, very interesting story that I just heard last year. Most stories of the Rebbe, they came out when the Rebbe was alive, but some of them came out later and later and later, and this one only came out last year. So there was a fellow who was at a wedding in Israel last year, and he sees a very elderly couple walking the Kala to the chuppah. And he's from the Chassan side, so he doesn't know the Kala side. So he says, can somebody tell me who is this couple walking the Kala to the chuppah? So the people there say, oh, that's the parents. So he says, what are you talking about? I know the Kala is 32. And the parents, he looks like he's in his 90s. And they said, yeah, he's 97. So he says, like, what? How could that be? So they told him the story. The neighbors who knew this fellow told him the story. This fellow's name is Moshe. His name is Avigail. His wife's name was Avigail. And they had 5 children. And Avigail was a very happy, woman, was always helping people, always in a good mood. Anyway, one of their sons was named Benny. And he was a very outgoing person. Everybody loved him. And unfortunately, he was killed in an ambush in Lebanon. This was during the time that Israel maintained that strip along the Lebanon border between itself and Lebanon. And he was patrolling there with a group. And unfortunately, it was an ambush and he was killed. Anyway, she fell into a deep depression. and she really couldn't get out of it. And everybody said, it'll pass eventually, but she really couldn't get out of it. And she really didn't know what to do. Her husband didn't know what to do. They kind of lost the will to live. Even though they had other children and one of them was married already. Anyway, one of their children had become a Chabadnik. And he said to them, why don't you go see the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Maybe he'll give you some advice. It was 1988. They went to see the Rebbe. He had some business to do in New York anyway. He was a jeweler or something. And the Rebbe at that time was in his house because his wife had passed away, and he was davening every day in his house. And people could come to see him in his house. He would give dollars from his house. So they went to see him, and she explained that her son was killed in Lebanon, and she wanted a bracha. And the Rebbe gave her $5. And then the Rebbe gave her another $1 and said, and this is for your daughter. And she didn't know what that was. What does it mean it's for my daughter? I mean, she didn't ask. There was no time to ask. You know, you got your $1 and you moved on. So they went back to the Rebbe's secretary, Rebbe Label Groner, and they said, we don't have a daughter. I mean, what does the Rebbe mean? I mean, my youngest child is 20. I'm not having any more children. I'm 51, and I don't have a daughter. So Rabbi Groner said, well, you have a daughter-in-law? So they said, yeah. So he says, maybe that's what the Rebbe meant. So they wrote on that $1, this $1 came from the Rebbe. He said it's for our daughter. Maybe it means our daughter-in-law, maybe not. When they got back to Israel, they gave it to her and they told her the whole thing. Anyway, but they were still depressed. They thought the Rebbe would help them. And instead, he said something that they didn't really understand, they didn't really relate to, they didn't know what it was about. Time went on, and as people with depression have, they had a lot of aches and pains, always going to doctors, always getting treatments and medications and whatever. And this time she went to a gynecologist, Avigail, because she was having issues. And they did all kinds of tests. They couldn't figure out what it was. And the gynecologist said, you know, we don't know, but maybe just take a rest a few days and come back. She was like, that you didn't need to go to you for. And he says, you know what? Why don't you take a pregnancy test? And she says to him, what, are you out of your mind? A pregnancy test? I'm 52 years old. My youngest child is 21. What do you think? He said, I know you're probably not, and there's such a slight chance, but, you know, based on your symptoms, maybe, who knows? Just take it and see. And she takes the test. And she's pregnant. And at that moment, she said her whole life changed for her and her husband. And she right away said to her husband, it's a girl. And this is the girl that the Rebbe promised. Anyway, they came back to the doctor the next day, and the doctor did more tests, and the doctor said, you have to abort. It's too dangerous, you're too old, high blood pressure, you can't keep this baby. They went to a second doctor, said the same thing. They went to a third doctor, said the same thing. It was like they were ganging up against them. They decided to fly back to New York. and tell the Rebbe, because this is the Rebbe's bracha, clearly, they're not going to do an abortion after such a bracha. They went to the Rebbe at dollars, and they told the Rebbe what was going on. And the Rebbe said, why do you have to waste your time in the doctor's office? Better to stay in the Weiber shul, that means the women's section, and say Tehillim. And that's what she did. First in 770 Eastern Parkway, and then when they got back to Israel where they lived in Ganei Tikva, she would go to shul all the time and say Tehillim. She did not see another doctor until the day she delivered her healthy girl. And they said that they felt later that this was the Rebbe's way of comforting them, because he realized there was no other comfort other than this. And this became their comfort, even though they never forgot their son, obviously, but they had something that they could live for. And when they had the baby, they strolled around their neighborhood like all new parents with their stroller, even though they looked like grandparents. And that's why at the young age of 97, and his wife was 80 something, they were walking their daughter to the chuppah. So that's the story.
Nice story.
Beautiful story.
Thank you. All right, who's going to give us the roundup? You don't have to round up the story, by the way. All right, I'll just have to take it on myself. So Yair had no children, and he was a great tzaddik, and he was also a great warrior, and he conquered the area of Gilad called Chevel Agov. It had cities and it had suburbs. He specifically called the suburbs Chavot Yair, because a suburb is like the child of the main city. Then he wanted his life to be remembered in that way. And he was also trying to accomplish a transformation of a place which had negative energy. We mentioned it was a place of idol worship, and a place which is a village, which denotes simplicity. He wanted to transform that into a place of light and godly revelation. All right. I hope you all have a good week and a good Shabbos after that.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Shabbos.
Thank
Great
you,
day,
Rabbi.
everybody.
Shalom.
Yeah, you too.
So the Argov, is that like the mountain? Argov?
No, it's with an aleph. Our gov.
An Aleph. Okay.
You'll see it at the end of the Devarim. I'm not sure what it means. Okay, all the best.